everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the REC podcast, more of a video podcast, digesting today, the 23rd of September's mini budget from Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng. And I say mini because we're not allowed to call it a budget, but it was just about the biggest fiscal event I can remember in 20 years of working in public policy for business organisations. So a really enormous range of things undertaken by this new cabinet at the beginning of the Liz Truss premiership. I'm joined here on the broadcast today by the REC's Deputy Chief Executive, Kate Shoesmith, and the REC's Campaigns Director, Shazia Ejaz, to pull apart some of what we're seeing and really look at what we think it means for the industry. Well, so thank you to you both for joining us. Kate, you have had the honour this afternoon of talking to some pretty shell-shocked civil servants about the scale of this and just understanding the direction of travel for the government. And I thought we might start with brass tacks, spelt TACKS rather than TAX, although both are appropriate for the industry itself, and then maybe work to the kind of bigger macroeconomic picture over time. So obviously, the headlines for recruiters here are a big move on IR35 in terms of the changes made in 2017 and 2021 being rolled away from, and of course that rolling back of the national insurance rise for employers that was announced back in the spring. Those things and other areas that might be of particular interest to recruiters, what are you picking up from the conversations you've had so far?
So we're definitely seeing a shift back. So this statement today was all about how do we row back from some of the earlier promised announcements. So the two that you've mentioned in terms of IR35 and national insurance contributions, I'll talk about those in just a bit more detail in a moment. But we also heard that there won't be a planned rise in corporation tax anymore, so it will remain at the 19%. We've heard that the annual investment allowance will not fall back to £200,000 as was originally previewed. It will stay up at the level of £1 million. So you know, there's a real sense of this is a different government that's rowing back on previous promises, all with the aim of supporting growth. But on the two particular points, so the national insurance contributions, the uplift that's been put in place, as of the 6th of November, we will go back. So what was there to be a future health and social care levy will not be put in place, and that's across the piece. So the 1.25% will go backwards, won't be there for both individuals, so employees, it won't be there on employers, it won't be on dividends. We're just going back to exactly what we had before. And on IR35, surprisingly, perhaps it's exactly the same. So the off-payroll rule changes that were brought in 2017 for the public sector, 2021 for the private sector after the delay with COVID, we're going back. So as of the 6th of April 2023, so the new tax year, the liability for assessing your IR35 status, determining that status, will sit back with the individual contractor. It will not be the liability of the agency or the end hirer. It will be back with the individual. Now that's really useful in so many ways, because we said who is best to determine your status in terms of IR35. Who knows best what the assignment looks like and what actual activities are going on? Who's under the supervision, direction and control here? It has to be the individual contractor. However, that is not to say that there weren't problems with IR35 pre these changes to the off-payroll rules. And some of those changes really remain. And that's been part of the conversation with the civil servants today in particular that we've had, is that where will the enforcement sit? So unless we resource this properly, how do we ensure that individuals are not perhaps lured into what look like very attractive schemes and actually don't do them any favors at all when it comes to HMRC? How does it all sit together with thinking through both your worker rights and your employment status and your tax liabilities? That's still an ongoing issue for many, and we really want to understand some of the things that are out there around the accountancy providers that can be classed as managed service companies. Really need to look at the HMRC guidelines around that, so that people are not misdirected in what they're being advised to do by accountancy solutions. So there's a lot for us to consider. We'll be updating all of our REC legal contracts in line with this. And I suppose the other thing is what we're expecting is the draft legislation that will sit behind this will come when we have an autumn fiscal event, which is still on the table. It's probably November time, but there's no date announced by government yet. That's when the draft legislation for these IR35 changes in particular will be put forward so that it can be enacted for the new tax year of April 2023. Until we see that draft legislation, the exact mechanisms for some of this, we don't know, but we assume we're going all the way back to what we had pre-21, pre-2017, and that's our best case scenario, and that's what we have to work with right now.
That's a really interesting point, that there's a really big commitment there from the government today, but nothing changes until the law changes, and we will have to work on that. And the important thing there is April matters. April 23 matters as a point for potential change, and I think people should be beginning to think about planning for that. Whereas national insurance as a tax rise can be reversed more easily and will be reversed in November, and that will be a boost, of course, to payrolls in this year, which is perhaps an unexpected bonus at this time for many businesses. And one of the arguments we made was that national insurance as a tax on jobs fell particularly heavily on some of our hardest pressed industries like hospitality, which are struggling to recover from the pandemic. The interesting thing about all of this is new governments like to start with a bang. They like to kind of get out there and set out an ideology. And this is a very clear ideology. It's, we're going to cut taxes and we want to go for growth. And the way we're going to go for growth is we want to get businesses investing. Now, you look across the business organizations, including the REC today, and there's a really positive response, because actually they've given business organizations a lot of the things that they've asked for in the past. You mentioned capital allowances, which are incredibly important to the CBI and to Make UK. IR35 is incredibly important to us. Having said all of that, the sheer scale of the intervention, and particularly proposals like the investment zones, are all about trying to encourage businesses to invest and drive growth that way. On the one level, the era of F-business is clearly over, and that is great news. This is a government that is putting business front and center. On the other hand, the scale of what they're doing is really significant, and you've identified already for us, Kate, that they're knocking down quite a lot of stuff. You're not going ahead with the corporation tax rise. But of course, to drive growth, you also need to build an enabling environment. And Charles, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because there's a lot in today's not a budget about investment zones, about regulatory reform, this idea that all retained EU law will fall over at the end of December 2023. Big changes on things like how the DWP systems for welfare to work, and of course, for a further kind of attack on the way that trade unions operate as well, which was a clear and sharp political arrow that the Chancellor fired. When you're looking at these things where government actually has to deliver and build some stuff up, what are we thinking about some of these? I think particularly, of course, members will be thinking about things like the working time regulations, which are on everyone's minds because of the recent Harper Trust case.
So yes, lots to unpack there. Let's start, as you say, with things like the working time regulations. So there were rumours that there was going to be a lot of deregulation in the announcement today, and what we had was yesterday there was something called the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill, nice and snappy title, that was published yesterday. And what that means, and the Chancellor mentioned it today, is that in December 2023, existing EU laws will be repealed, and that will include any sort of UK statutory instruments that existed that enabled us to comply with EU law. So although we didn't get a specific mention around the working time regulations today, I think there will be more to come in and around the use of that bill. So you know, we at the REC and others have been talking about the need to reform working time regulations for a long time. So, you know, things that cover, you know, employment. There is some good stuff in there covering employee rights around, you know, rest time. So important health and safety things. But we know that, you know, regulations that were brought in 1998 haven't kept pace with modern working practices. So, you know, calculating holiday pay and things like that have been difficult. So we will be looking for reform, and we hope that we can work with government on refining some of the detail around that. What we don't want with any of this stuff is to throw out the baby with the bathwater. So we think it's important that now in the interim, we get to have the right dialogue with different government departments and agencies about how we refine things so that they work well, and that there is clarity. That's the most important thing about how businesses operate with whatever sort of changes that come about.
Just on
Yeah.
that thing about simplicity and clarity, I think really matters, because I just want to really land this point that you've made, just so that listeners get this. That's all EU legislation will fall in 15 months' time. The government has set itself the motherlode of an essay crisis in terms of, if you think about our sector, EU-derived health and safety law, the working time regulations, the agency work regulations. Now, we cannot, for the life of us, any of us, believe that the United Kingdom is going to be the only nation in the world that doesn't have working time regulations of any form on the 1st of January 2024. So something will happen. But next year is an incredibly important year now for all of us in the business community to get this right. So we'll be talking about, you know, well, what are the British agency work regulations, and what are the British working time regulations? And as part of that, this is where the politics gets interesting, doesn't it, Shar? So because we're in a very contested political time. You've got a new government. They're clearly trying to stake out some ideological ground with what's happening today. But on the flip side, they're 10 points behind in the polls. And case in point for us as an industry, the agency workers regulations are relatively settled. We have a qualification period for equal treatment of 13 weeks. If the government rewrites it one way and Labour wins a general election, they could rewrite it the other way in 2 or 3 years' time. So there's a real kind of pressure to get this time right for us as an industry, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very safe to say that the REC campaigns and legal teams are going to be incredibly busy from now on to try and work with government and negotiate with government, because as you say, there's a lot of political ideology involved here that will need to be carefully navigated by us so that we get the right results for industry. You know, so much so that as you talk about a potential general election where a Labour government could come in and change things. I mean, there is definitely things that have been announced in today's budget, and even in the recent weeks since Liz Truss took over as Prime Minister, that, you know, people that were in the Tory cabinet only a month or two ago would raise their eyebrows at. So there's a lot to do and there's a lot to watch for, and we will definitely be doing that and keeping members up to date. You also pointed to, Neil, some of the other things around, you know, to do with some of the more political points that might have come across in the budget. So there's been messages for unions around essentially making sure that they will have to bring pay offers, take pay offers to government and vice versa, and that's I think that's important because we want a situation where we've got, in a very tight labour market, we want industrial relations to be smooth, and we don't want sort of unnecessarily prolonged situations. So I think that's something that we will be watching, and I think that the unions will potentially be looking to test the government on. Within that, I can imagine, and we've already seen some commentary today, with the government's announcements on economic employment inactivity, and new rules around those that are on universal credit and what they will need to do to maintain their universal credit if they're not working what's deemed to be enough hours. So essentially, if you're on universal credit and you're working part-time hours, for example, you will be encouraged with extra work coaching support, but you will be encouraged to do more hours or be at risk of losing those benefits. Now, I think for us at the REC, everybody hopefully watching and listening will have been seen that we've been talking a lot about what's needed to overcome the labour and skill shortages in the market. And we don't think that this is necessarily the right way to go about things. What was announced today around potential penalties for those on universal credit isn't a plan for overcoming shortages. And that's really what we're looking for. Essentially, if people are able to do more and are supported to work more, then that is great. But we need all of the support infrastructure around that, like transport, like affordable childcare, to enable people who have got to make a decision between working more hours and being able to pay for the cost of childcare. It's not going to help them to be penalised. And actually, what we really need is a long-term workforce strategy that business and industry can work with government on, that, for example, looks to solve a much bigger problem, which is around how do we get workers over 50, older workers, back into work. There's some announcements on that today about looking to give older workers more work coach support, but it still falls short of a really good comprehensive workforce strategy that we need.
Yeah, and I think if we were going to be kind to the government, we say that might change over time. But there's a lot here. You talk about the scale of the regulatory tasks they've set themselves. Here we've got another area where they know they need to make some progress. There are a couple of things to pick apart in that sanctions regime. Is why do we not think it's effective? Well, for one hand, I know plenty of members around the country have said to me that if the job centre sends them someone to interview, they want that person to want to be there and to be ready for an interview. And if they're not, and they're just fulfilling a requirement for their benefits, well, that's a waste of that person's time. It's also a waste of a recruiter's time. So we need to make sure that the support that's happening, and we're doing some great work through our Restart programme at the moment, placing well over 100 people into work this year. We've got to get that thinking challenge across DWP into thinking more about the ultimate destination being not an interview but work, and that will help to resolve things. Of course, nothing at all in the announcement today about reforming the apprenticeship levy or changes on immigration, both of which would actually be really useful in terms of creating some capacity for the economy to grow. But more broadly, that whole scale of delivery comes back actually to something Kate said earlier. This is both a big announcement fiscally on the tax side, big spending, lots of support going in alongside the tax cuts or cancelling tax rises, to supporting business energy costs for the next 6 months, capping them for the next 6 months. But actually, government's also set itself a massive task here. And Kate, I wanted to ask you about that in terms of just the scale of what we've got to do here. This feels like something where it would be easy for members perhaps to overreact today, and some of this will take a long time to come through, and will require, exactly as Shazia was saying, a level of consistency from the REC working with members for the next year or more.
That's precisely it, and as Shah said, we're going to be busy in terms of talking to government on behalf of members, making sure that we're involved in those conversations, talking to the broader stakeholder community, because it's going to be really important that we understand the wider business views on some of this and how it will work in practice. On some of this, what we're talking about is reforming things that have been in existence for 20 plus years. So it's not going to be an overnighter. If we think about, if you join it together, when you've got a sense of us reforming some of those employment rights systems, if you like, that have been in place for quite some time, at the same time looking at how do you encourage more people into a workforce, you've got to see if this is fit for purpose in today's labour market. And that's where we think we can add the most amount of value is what's the reality of what is it like on the ground right now in terms of the jobs market? How does it really feel when you are trying to attract candidates to particular sectors, to particular regions and areas of growth? And if we're going to make these investment zones work, that's where we need to have proper input from business. So the message we've just given to our government colleagues in a call before we recorded this was, if you really want those investment zones to work, you can't do it by saying that let's give this all over to the local authorities and ask them to deliver on these plans. It won't happen if you have Whitehall decreeing this centrally. You've got to involve all of the people that really understand the local jobs market. They understand exactly how the actors work in partnership together. We need the training skill systems, to your point, Neil, about the apprenticeship levy. There's a pot of money there that can be given over to really helping us upskill those people that are perhaps furthest away from the jobs market right now, or from progression opportunities. And if we don't allow those individuals who are really understanding what our jobs market looks like right now, these investment zones won't deliver. So this is not going to be an overnight win. Unleashing some of the planning laws and overturning those so that we have infrastructure builds, you won't see cranes appear tomorrow. This is going to take quite a lot of planning and a lot of investment. But if we don't have that business involvement in this, we don't think it can deliver in the way that it should.
Yeah, so carry on, Chas.
Absolutely, Kate. I was just going to say that, we've been calling for more devolution at local level to enable that skills investment to go to the right sorts of areas that local recruiters, those working with local businesses, know where the skills and the jobs demands are. So that's really crucial. And essentially, it's great that there's been some changes around tax that will free up businesses to invest, but that investment needs to be designed and planned together with other local bodies, so that there's potentially workers get the right training and employers and businesses get most bang for buck.
That picks up on something that I want to talk to. This deliverability challenge for the government and what they're going for today is really high. So IR35, we're pretty solid. That's changing back in April to pre-2017. Tax rise and CT isn't coming. NI's being reversed. Those are all great bankable things. Big tick now, those are going to happen. They might look a bit different to what we expect now, but those are going to happen. This stuff is really difficult, whether it's kind of redesigning the working time regulations, or we saw it yesterday with the fracking debate in Parliament. If the Cabinet can stand up and say, we're pro-fracking now, that feels a bit different to a Conservative backbench MP whose constituency it is. The same's true. One of the investment zones that's been mooted as a possibility is the entirety of Greater London. And you think about, okay, so we're going to minimise, the proposals, we're going to minimise planning restrictions for the entirety of Greater London. This is a place where recently Conservative MPs were celebrating not having some flats built on a brownfield site next to a Zone 6 underground station. The political risks here are huge. And I just wanted to emphasise that highly political time means that the government has promised this today, and what we are likely to get is somewhat more narrow. If we can use this period to bank some of the good decisions that are made today, but also make some progress on some things that are helpful to the industry. And that's where we're going to need your help over the next 12 to 15 months in terms of shaping that debate, then great. But I think there's a lot here in this giant essay crisis that Kwasi set himself this morning that we need to pick up. And I think that's why I wanted to close by saying a little about the macroeconomics of this, because it's very telling. And Kate, you made this point to Shazia and I earlier, that if you look at the business reaction today, broadly, it's positive but cautious, because there's lots in there to, after a long period of business being slightly sidelined in the political debate, the idea that a government is saying, yeah, business has got to deliver this and we're going full bore for it, is fantastic. But they've turned it up to 11 on everything. So it's not just some of the things that business has been looking for: the cancellation of the CT rise, changes on R35, the reversing of the NI rate. It's also getting rid of the 45 pence tax rate for higher earners. It's a 1 pence reduction in income tax for all. Those things cost a phenomenal amount of money, and there is no proposal for a fiscal consolidation on the spending side in today's announcement. And of course, in many areas, education or health, it's absolutely fundamental to the economy that there isn't a fiscal consolidation in those fields. So you see already the big debate amongst economic commentators, as distinct from business commentators and in the markets, is, can the national credit card take this? Because we shouldn't beat around the bush. Kwasi's putting it on the national credit card. And for how long is a question mark. And the big challenge is what that does to the pound. And you see the pound dropping already. 30-year gilt rates are above 4% for the first time since, I had more hair than I have now. So there is a really big challenge here, which is, having taken action to cap inflation by capping energy costs, are we now going to insert inflation this in intervention? We should be clear, it's not, it's a big gamble. If investment flows and the economy grows, it could work, it could be built. It worked for Ronald Reagan in the United States in the 80s. Alternatively, it could cause some real problems in higher inflation. The last British government to try to do this was Ted Heath's in 1972, and the Barber budget in 72 is widely viewed now as the worst budget in British history. So there is a real element of the gamble in going hard for this. And they've made a political statement. And I think the politics of this, about when the election is and what they're trying to achieve, is really, really interesting. But I think the range of possible outcomes for the UK economically has just gone from that to about that. And I think as business owners and as business leaders, it's really important that we have that in our long-term planning. Does that make sense to you, Kate?
It makes real sense to me, and so a lot of this is devil in the detail. We see where it goes. We see how it affects the pound going forward. It's going to be really important to be watching on those markets. One of the things that we haven't talked about, because it was announced yesterday, if you like, was around the energy price caps and about what that means for businesses. We were promised earlier that there would be an equivalent support for businesses as there is for households, and a lot of the commentators now are saying, actually, that's great. But what it's doing is it's pushing out the pain for just 6 months. So for us, there's going to be a really key piece of work to be thinking through. Well, that's okay. It's perhaps keeping the worst away and at bay for those 6 months. But we know in 3 months' time, they're going to review which businesses and which public sector organisations keep those energy price caps. But it's not there. It's not going to be there for all. I can't see the office-based professional services will be top of that list, to be quite frank. So there's going to have to be a real thinking through of this is just a short-term intermediary measure. So for us to be watching the markets is all important.
I think that's really helpful. And I want to finish on the politics a little bit, because clearly this is a big and ideological move. I genuinely do think this government believes it. It's a very difficult move for them to make because so many of them have been in a Conservative government that took a very different approach a month ago.
Including the Prime Minister herself.
Including the
and
Prime
the
Minister.
Chancellor.
Well, indeed. But there is definitely kind of a very clear ideological bent there. I don't think this is primarily about pushing it out long enough to have a general election in the spring, although that may be on their minds. But there's definitely a pressure that has been placed onto the Labour Party here by a government that has moved. Labour have been polling relatively well recently. And I think, Shaz, you're our political guru on these things. I wanted to finish by asking you about the Labour response here, because we're now in a period where organisations like the REC, all businesses need to think of Labour as an alternative government. We're 2 years max out from a general election and they're 10 points ahead in the polls. What do you think the opportunities and threats are for the Labour Party in looking at a government who's now doing this?
Sometimes in recent years, the criticism from members of the public and people not as engaged in politics and economics as we all are has been, what's the point? They're all the same. I think what we've seen today is a very clear line that actually they're not the same. And the Tory government have done that. And now it's up to Labour to really demonstrate to their traditional supporters. I mean, today is definitely not been a budget designed to think about the sort of red wall, those people that voted Tory for the first time in a long time, or maybe ever. I mean, this budget wasn't designed for them today particularly. So there's an opportunity here for Labour to think about their policies and how they, meet the challenge and rise to the challenge of offering business what business needs, because, business has been offered quite a lot today, but there are, you talked about Reaganomics. Reaganomics by some was deemed a huge success, but there were a lot of social issues that came as a result of Reaganomics. And it will be for this Labour Party to think about what the balance to the economic offer is, and where we spread some of that, where the sort of pain at the lower ends of the economy, where income levels are low, what is done for people in those lower income jobs, and where the investment for public services comes. You talked about putting it on the credit card. It's interesting that the international markets are responding to that. Borrowing is high, not low, and that investment is for tax decrease rather than public sector investment. And I think that's where Labour have got some space to show what they want to do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's two things that we'll see a lot from the Labour Party. The first thing is the distributional graph across the deciles of today's index, which literally is a diagonal line. The more you earn, the better off today has made you. That is a ideological decision by the government, which says when you cut tax across the board, people who pay more tax end up paying less in pure pounds and pence terms, and they are all right with that. That's what Liz Truss said when she was atop the Empire State Building the other day in New York when she was at the UN General Assembly. Labour will use that because obviously inflation will remain high through the winter. It may not reach 15% now, but it will still be double-digit, close to double-digit through this period. And I think that the other thing that we need to make sure that we look at is how Labour articulates itself on business issues. There's a real risk here that if the government goes rapidly pro-business, or what they perceive as rapidly pro-business, that we end up with a snapback from the Labour Party, which is actually quite challenging to those of us who believe in flexible labour markets. So staying close to them, as we have on issues like the strike reforms in the summer, is going to be really, really important as well. All of this leads me to one major conclusion from this discussion, which is this is the most uncertain and potentially changeable time in politics and economics in the UK for as long as I can remember. And I can remember the 1983 general election. I think from our perspective, there's some stuff for REC members to think about today, but there's also quite a lot for us to work with members in for the next few years. So maybe I happily see opportunities in everything, but I think the REC has a huge role to play for members over the next 15 months, which if we've got a government that wants to change our regulation and everything else, we're going to have quite a time on our hands. So delighted to start it with this podcast. Thank you for all for joining us. Kate, Shaz, thank you for bringing all the quality as always, and the content to this. And as ever, your REC is here online on the helpline to walk through any of this. And if you have specific questions, I know I speak for myself, but for Kate and Shaz as well, if you want to get in touch with us directly, you know where we are. We're your organisation. Thank you for joining us. Hope this has helped with understanding today's major mini budget. And we'll see you all soon on another REC podcast. Thanks.